Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering here today as we reflect on a subject that weighs heavily on many hearts: the rising tensions between Israel and Iran. We are not just talking about politics or headlines, we are talking about prophecy, purpose, and God's plan. And the pressing question on many minds is this: is Ezekiel 38 happening now? Let us begin by grounding ourselves in Scripture. Ezekiel 38 speaks of a time when a coalition of nations led by Gog of the land of Magog comes against Israel, a land that has been regathered from the nations, dwelling in peace and security. The prophecy names several ancient nations: Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, and Beth Togarmah, many of which are believed by scholars to correspond with modern countries, including Iran, Turkey, Sudan, Libya, and regions of Russia. The rebirth of Israel in 1948 marked one of the most significant geopolitical and prophetic events of the 20th century. For nearly 2 millennia, the Jewish people had been scattered across the world, exiled from their homeland following the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, despite enduring persecution and cultural challenges. They maintained a distinct identity and an enduring hope to return to their ancestral land. This longing was rooted in the promises of the Hebrew Scriptures, which foretold a time when God would bring his people back from the nations to the land he had given them. Ezekiel 38 presumes a setting where Israel is not only restored as a nation, but is settled securely in its own land. The prophecy speaks of a people gathered from many nations, living in what had long been a desolate land. When Israel was officially declared a state in 1948, it fulfilled a condition that many Bible scholars consider foundational to the unfolding of end-time prophecies. It wasn't merely a political event. It was seen as divine orchestration, a fulfillment of numerous Old Testament passages that describe the regathering of the Jewish people in the last day. The return of the Jewish people to their homeland began in earnest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with waves of immigration known as Aliyah. These migrations grew over time, culminating in the formation of the State of Israel after World War II and the Holocaust. The horrors of that period had a profound impact on international opinion and galvanized support for the Jewish homeland. Thus, a people without a country for nearly 2,000 years suddenly had a nation once more, in what many saw as a miracle. This regathering was not just symbolic, but a literal fulfillment of prophecy. Ezekiel 36 and 37 precede the war chapter of Ezekiel 38, and they describe Israel's spiritual and physical restoration. The vision of the dry bones coming to life in Ezekiel 37 is one of the most vivid prophetic images of Israel's resurrection as a nation. The people, once scattered and lifeless in the spiritual sense, would rise again, breathe life, and be planted in their own land. The sequence of events leads naturally into Ezekiel 38. Israel's rebirth set the stage for a host of biblical prophecies that require the existence of the Jewish nation. Without a nation called Israel, the stage described in Ezekiel 38 could not be properly set. The idea that a coalition of hostile nations would come against a non-existent state would be illogical. But once Israel was reborn and began to grow in strength, technology, and agriculture, its presence became increasingly provocative to surrounding enemies and influential on the global stage, attracting both interest and opposition. The prophecy also notes that the land of Israel had long been desolate. Before Jewish return, the land was largely barren and underdeveloped, as documented by early explorers and historians. Mark Twain, in his 1867 travel writings, described it as a forsaken place. Yet today, Israel has turned deserts into fertile fields, developed world-leading agricultural techniques, and become a hub of innovation and technology. This transformation aligns with biblical descriptions of the land blooming once the people return, as found in Isaiah and Ezekiel. Ezekiel's prophecy emphasizes that the people would be gathered from among the nations. This is a critical point because the Jewish diaspora was global. Jews returned from Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and even the Americas. This global ingathering has been ongoing since 1948. with major waves of immigration from places like Ethiopia and the former Soviet Union. The diversity of Israel's population today reflects the fulfillment of this gathering from many nations, not merely from one region or empire. Furthermore, the prophecy doesn't just describe a return, but also a degree of peace and establishment. While Israel has faced conflict since its founding, the mere fact of its survival and development despite overwhelming odds has been extraordinary. Surrounded by enemies and vastly outnumbered in its early wars, Israel repeatedly emerged victorious. These successes have allowed it to become a relatively secure and advanced nation in many respects, which leads some to believe that the dwelling safely phrase in Ezekiel 38 may already be partially fulfilled or figurative. Even the establishment of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel in modern times reflects prophetic significance. Jerusalem is central to biblical prophecy, and the fact that it is once again under Jewish control adds to the sense that we are living in times that align with Scripture. The city, sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, continues to play a central role in both geopolitics and prophecy, making it a lightning rod for international spiritual significance. While skeptics might argue that political processes led to the creation of Israel, many believers see God's hand guiding history. The survival of the Jewish people through centuries of persecution, their return to a desolate homeland, and the rebirth of their language and culture all point to a supernatural preservation and restoration. This is not merely a national story, it is a prophetic narrative unfolding in real time. It gives weight to the idea that we are moving closer to the events foretold in Ezekiel and other biblical books. In the context of Ezekiel 38, the modern rebirth of Israel is not just a backdrop but a prerequisite. Without Israel's restoration, the stage would not be set for the future conflict that the prophet describes. Therefore, to ask whether Ezekiel 38 is happening now is to acknowledge that a foundational element of that prophecy has undeniably occurred. The nation exists, the land has come alive, and the people have returned, exactly as the prophet said they would. Ezekiel 38 lists several ancient nations that will form a coalition against Israel, and among them is Persia, which corresponds directly to modern-day Iran. This is one of the clearest and most direct connections between biblical prophecy and present-day geopolitics. The inclusion of Persia in the list makes the role of Iran in today's Middle East conflicts especially significant. Iran is not just mentioned symbolically. It is named as a primary player in a future military alliance that comes against Israel. This leads many to believe that Iran's current hostility toward Israel is not coincidental but prophetically relevant. Iran's political and religious leadership openly expresses animosity toward Israel. Senior Iranian leaders, including the supreme leader and top military officials, have repeatedly called for the destruction of the Jewish state. Such rhetoric is not limited to speeches, it translates into policy. Iran has developed and funded proxy militias across the region whose stated mission is to oppose Israel. Groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Islamic Jihad in Gaza are armed, trained, and funded by Iran, creating a constant and immediate threat along Israel's borders. These actions are direct extensions of Iran's anti-Israel agenda. In Ezekiel's time, Persia was a major empire with influence across the ancient Near East. Its mention in the prophecy implies that it will again play a significant role in end-time events. Today, Iran is aggressively expanding its influence in the region through what some analysts call a Shia Crescent, a network of aligned political and military forces stretching from Iran through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. This sphere of influence has brought Iranian forces and their allies into close proximity with Israel, making the possibility of direct confrontation more realistic than ever. Iran's nuclear program adds another layer of urgency and danger to the equation. Despite international agreements and inspections, Iran has continued to advance its nuclear capabilities, leading to fears that it could soon possess a nuclear weapon. Israel has made it clear that it will not allow this to happen and has conducted sabotage operations and cyber attacks to slow Iran's progress. The nuclear threat not only increases tensions but also raises the stakes in the broader conflict. aligning with the kind of existential threat described in the Ezekiel 38 invasion. Furthermore, Iran's presence in Syria brings its military assets directly to Israel's northern border. Through its involvement in the Syrian civil war, Iran has built military bases, moved troops, and transferred advanced weaponry to its proxy groups. Israel regularly strikes Iranian targets in Syria to prevent these weapons from being used against its citizens. This ongoing shadow war illustrates how Iran is positioning itself for potential large-scale conflict, possibly in line with the future scenario described by Ezekiel. Iran also invests heavily in missile technology. It possesses thousands of short and medium-range ballistic missiles capable of striking anywhere in Israel. Many of these have already been handed to Hezbollah and other Iranian-backed groups. The fact that a single nation, Persia, is actively and strategically preparing for potential war with Israel reinforces the notion that this element of Ezekiel 38 is not only plausible but unfolding in real time. The military dimension of the prophecy is visibly materializing. Beyond military tactics, Iran is also engaged in an ideological war. The Islamic Republic sees itself as the vanguard of resistance against the West and Israel, which it often refers to as the Zionist regime. This framing is not merely political, it is spiritual. In many Iranian sermons and official statements, Israel is painted as a corrupting force that must be removed for divine justice to prevail. This apocalyptic worldview mirrors the spiritual undercurrents found in biblical prophecy, where the conflict is not just territorial but cosmic in nature. In addition to its actions and alliances, Iran seeks to unite other nations in its opposition to Israel, which could contribute to the coalition described in Ezekiel 38. It has strengthened ties with countries like Russia and Turkey, both of which are also mentioned under ancient names in the prophecy. Joint military drills, economic partnerships, and coordinated foreign policy efforts indicate that these nations are forming a strategic bloc. The idea of Iran joining a future alliance with these countries to launch a campaign against Israel is not far-fetched. Iran's long-standing hatred for Israel has deepened with every regional conflict. From the Iran-Iraq war to recent proxy wars in Yemen and Syria, Iran has used every opportunity to extend its influence and surround Israel with hostility. This strategy reflects the kind of encirclement seen in Ezekiel's vision. The nation's increasing militarization and religious zealotry make it one of the most dangerous actors in the region. It is not hard to imagine Iran taking a leading role in a broader assault on Israel, just as the prophecy states. From a prophetic standpoint, Iran's prominence today matches the biblical forecast precisely. In Ezekiel 38, Persia is not a footnote, it is a central participant. The fact that this ancient empire still exists under the same name and with such explicit hostility toward Israel is a powerful affirmation of Scripture's accuracy. While we must interpret prophecy with caution and spiritual discernment, the alignment of Iran's modern behavior with its prophesied role should cause believers to take notice. It serves as a dramatic reminder that biblical prophecy remains alive and relevant in today's headlines. The prophecy in Ezekiel 38 outlines a coalition of nations that will unite against Israel in the last days. The ancient names listed, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah, Persia, Cush, and Put, are understood by many scholars to refer to modern regions such as Russia, Turkey, Iran, Libya, Sudan, and possibly others. The convergence of these nations into alliances and partnerships in our time has drawn the attention of many prophecy watchers. These nations, which were once divided by culture, religion, or political ideology, are increasingly finding common ground, especially when it comes to opposing Israel and Western influence. Russia, widely associated with Magog and Rosh, has become a dominant player in the Middle East, especially since its military intervention in Syria in 2015. By stationing troops and building air bases in Syria, Russia has secured a foothold just north of Israel. Its partnerships with Iran and Turkey have grown stronger through various trilateral talks and economic agreements. Though historically adversarial, these three nations are now collaborating in new and unprecedented ways, strengthening military and political ties that seem to mirror the alliance described in Ezekiel's prophecy. Turkey, linked to Gomer and Togarmah in biblical geography, has increasingly taken a more Islamist and anti-Israel stance under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The once a close ally of Israel, Turkey's rhetoric and policies have shifted over the past decade. It has supported Hamas, criticized Israeli actions in Gaza, and strengthened ties with Iran and Russia. Turkey's military strength, regional ambitions, and ideological leanings make it a key component in any future coalition against Israel, further aligning it with the role outlined for it in the ancient prophecy. Iran, identified as Persia in Ezekiel 38, has already taken a leading role in opposing Israel through direct threats and the funding of proxy militias. Its cooperation with Russia and Turkey further deepens the potential for an alliance that could become hostile toward Israel. Joint military exercises, intelligence sharing, and strategic diplomacy among these nations suggest a foundation is being laid for future military cooperation. What was once geographically and ideologically improbable is now visibly forming through real-world political and military engagements in the region. Libya and Sudan, historically unstable and embroiled in internal conflict, are not to be overlooked. Known in Ezekiel as Put and Cush, these regions are slowly becoming areas of influence for more dominant powers like Russia and Iran. Russian mercenaries have been involved in Libya's civil war, and Sudan has shifted allegiances in recent years, at times cozying up to nations hostile to Israel. While these countries are not yet fully mobilized against Israel, their inclusion in the alliance described by Ezekiel suggests their future role in a broader, unified opposition. What is striking about these alliances is not just their formation, but the rapid acceleration of cooperation. In recent years, joint military exercises involving Russia, Iran, and China have taken place, with Turkey also showing interest. These drills demonstrate not only tactical cooperation, but also a symbolic unity among powers that seek to counterbalance U.S. and Western influence, especially in the Middle East. Since Israel is a close ally of the West, especially the United States, it becomes a natural target for this rising bloc of nations with shared grievances. Ezekiel's prophecy emphasizes that this alliance will come against a prosperous and secure Israel, suggesting a calculated and deliberate campaign rather than a spontaneous eruption of violence. The deepening strategic relations among these nations, particularly in Syria and around Israel's borders, indicates a possible military encirclement. Bases, missile deployments, intelligence, and economic deals all point to a slow, coordinated buildup of power that could one day shift toward open aggression against the Jewish state, fulfilling the military dimensions of Ezekiel 38. Economic cooperation among these nations also plays a key role in strengthening their alliance. Russia and Iran, both under Western sanctions, have turned to each other for trade, technology, and arms. Turkey, while a NATO member, increasingly distances itself from Western alignment and seeks economic independence through partnerships with the East. Oil, weapons, infrastructure, and energy routes have become the building blocks of an alliance that not only shares military goals, but economic interdependence, a foundation that can support joint military campaigns in the future. The presence of these nations in Syria cannot be understated. Syria borders Israel to the north and has become a staging ground for Iranian militias, Russian forces, and Turkish interests. While these powers claim to operate in Syria for counterterrorism or political stability, their proximity to Israel and their growing infrastructure there cannot be ignored. If a large-scale invasion were to be planned, Syria would likely serve as a launch pad. Ezekiel 38 mentions the attack will come from the north, and geographically, Syria fits that description perfectly. While critics might see these developments as coincidental, the specificity of Ezekiel's prophecy, combined with modern geopolitical trends, makes it difficult to ignore the correlation. The alliance described in the Bible is not vague or metaphorical. It lists specific nations or regions, many of which are actively aligning today in ways that would have seemed impossible even a generation ago. This convergence, seen in military, economic, and ideological spheres, leads many to believe that the framework for Ezekiel 38 is being constructed right before our eyes. Ezekiel 38 describes Israel as living in peace and safety when the invasion takes place, which raises an important question about the current state of the nation. Today, Israel is far from dwelling in total peace. The country remains under constant threat from multiple fronts: Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. It maintains one of the most advanced military forces in the world precisely because of the threats surrounding it. Frequent rocket attacks, terrorist activities, and geopolitical hostilities ensure that Israel is always on high alert, contradicting the peaceful setting described in the prophecy. This suggests that the prophecy is not yet fully fulfilled. Israel's security posture is one of the most fortified on the planet. Every major city has bomb shelters, and the Iron Dome defense system intercepts rockets regularly. Military service is mandatory, and citizens are constantly reminded of the need for vigilance. This level of defense infrastructure does not reflect a nation living in unguarded peace. Instead, it indicates a society prepared for war. Ezekiel's portrayal of a nation living without walls or bars does not match this reality, which raises important considerations for the timing and interpretation of the prophecy. Some scholars interpret the phrase "dwelling safely" in Ezekiel 38 as referring to a sense of national confidence or sovereignty, rather than total absence of conflict. Under this view, Israel's strength and deterrence capabilities may give it a sense of control and stability, fulfilling the prophecy in a symbolic rather than literal way. Yet this interpretation remains debated. The literal language about unwalled villages and a peaceful, unsuspecting population seems to suggest a different, more serene environment than what we see in Israel today. The borders of Israel are some of the most militarized in the world. From the security fence along the West Bank to the border walls with Gaza and Lebanon, the nation is surrounded by physical barriers. These walls are designed to prevent infiltration and attacks, highlighting the level of threat Israel faces. In Ezekiel's prophecy, however, Israel is portrayed as living without such defenses, trusting in their peace and prosperity. The contrast between this vision and today's reality makes it unlikely that the prophecy has already begun its full fulfillment. Israel continues to engage in near-daily military operations. Its Air Force strikes Iranian targets in Syria, and clashes with Hezbollah on the northern border occur frequently. Internally, the nation deals with political instability and internal division. The presence of hostile actors in close proximity keeps the Israeli Defense Forces in a state of readiness at all times. This environment is not conducive to the kind of peace Ezekiel describes. Any suggestion that Israel is currently in the prophesied state of unwalled peace seems inconsistent with observable facts. Another key point is the temporary and conditional nature of the Abraham Accord. While some Arab nations have normalized relations with Israel, these agreements are still fragile and do not constitute full regional peace. The accords represent progress, but they do not eliminate the existential threats from Iran and its proxies. Moreover, public opinion in many of these nations remains hostile to Israel. A true fulfillment of Ezekiel's vision would likely require a broader and more genuine peace across the entire region, which remains far from reality. Furthermore, the internal security challenges Israel faces also contribute to its constant state of alert. Issues like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, flare-ups in East Jerusalem, and tensions surrounding the Temple Mount all prevent the atmosphere of calm and unguarded peace described in Ezekiel 38. These internal conflicts are not merely political. They are deeply rooted in religion, history, and identity, making them difficult to resolve. The combination of external and internal threats reinforces the view that the prophecy's peace has not yet materialized. In addition, Israel's economy, while strong, is heavily influenced by defense spending. A significant portion of its national budget is allocated to security and military development. Citizens are accustomed to living with the risk of conflict. The regularity of emergency drills and security protocols in schools, offices, and public transportation further indicate a society that is not living in unworried peace. Ezekiel's image of a people dwelling securely without fear does not align with this high alert way of life that defines modern Israel. Prophetically speaking, many believe that the peaceful conditions in Ezekiel 38 might only occur after a significant political or spiritual transformation, possibly following the rapture or during the early tribulation period. Under this interpretation, Israel's peace would be the result of a deceptive treaty or a temporary lull before the storm. This would explain how the nation could let its guard down and become vulnerable to an overwhelming invasion, as described in the prophecy. Until such a transformation occurs, the current climate does not seem to support the invasion scenario outlined in Scripture. Ultimately, while Israel exists and is thriving in many areas, its current situation does not yet reflect the full peace and safety described in Ezekiel 38. The constant threats, military posture, and fortified borders all point to a nation that remains cautious and prepared, not unsuspecting and unprotected. For the prophecy to unfold as written, a shift, whether political, spiritual, or geopolitical, would likely need to occur. Until then, we can say that the pieces may be forming, but the full picture has not yet come into place.